On this week's Talking Politics, Robert Jenrick's video stunts.
Why is it that Keir Starmer's Attorney General, Lord Hermer, represented all these clients? Jerry Adams, not one, not two, not three, not four, but 5 terrorists.
This is really harmful stuff. Who is going to defend, basically people who may or may not have done terrible things in a world where the prevailing view of the British public is if you defend them, you're endorsing them?
The challenges and big dangers facing Rachel Reeves.
If the Chancellor's lucky, something will turn up and the economy might suddenly discover a gear it hasn't got. If it doesn't, I think tax rises of some degree are inevitable.
And the occasional unwelcome phone call too.
Which is the years that the spending review, I'm so sorry, I think that's the editor of News at 10.
Welcome to the show. I'm Paul Brand and I'm joined by Robert Peston here in the studio. We'll be talking winter fuel and also looking ahead to next week's spending review with our economics editor Joel Hills. But first, we have to talk about Robert Jenrick. The Tory leader in waiting, or wanting at least, has now become a video stunt artist, it seems. It started with this video where he confronts tube passengers he accused of fare dodging on the London Underground.
Do you want to go back and pay like everybody else? Seriously, why do you go back through the barrier and pay? Do you think it's all right not to pay? Why don't you go back and pay? It's also just annoying watching so many people break the law and get away with it. It's the same with bike theft, phone theft, tool theft, shoplifting, drugs in town centres, weird Turkish barber shops. It's all chipping away at society.
That's now been viewed almost 15 million times, far more than, say, PMQs. And he's now followed that up with another video on his X page attacking Keir Starmer's choice of Attorney General, Lord Hermer, and calling for him to be sacked.
Why is it that Keir Starmer's Attorney General, Lord Hermer, represented all these clients? Jerry Adams, not one, not two, not three, not four, but 5 terrorists. Last week people called for Hermer to resign after he likened those criticising the ECHR to the Nazis. But the truth is Starmer should never have appointed him in the first place. And why did he? Because they share exactly the same views. Britain deserves better than the pair of them.
Well, that video's had more than 1.5 million views in just 24 hours and has a lot of reaction to it too. For example, the former Attorney General, Dominic Grieve, has branded it particularly disgraceful, saying if these comments had been made even 6 years ago by a Conservative spokesman, I would have expected any party leader to have them sacked on the spot. So, Robert, aside from the kind of controversies around the content of these videos, what do you make of the fact that Robert Jenrick is putting them out there and getting massive views of them?
Well, it's an open secret within the Tory party that he remains somebody very keen to lead the Tory party. And you'll remember he was a candidate last time. He was... can't remember the exact margin, but he put up a good fight. But in the end, he got through to the last 2. In the end, we all thought this was going to happen right at the end. Kemi Badenoch won, largely because she had more of the sort of party's establishment, you might say, on her side. But he is somebody undaunted, and it's sort of interesting that, if you ask Kemi about his activities of this sort, she would say it's great for the profile of the party that he's making such an impact.
It's not normal for a Shadow Justice Secretary to have a profile this big, though, is it? Shadow Justice is almost sort of like tumbleweed department in lots of shadow cabinets. He's right up there. His profile arguably is higher than Kemi Badenoch's at the moment.
Look, he has definitely made more of this brief than, as you say, normally. It's not so much that they're tumbleweed, but they are not sort of at the sharp end of day-to-day fist-fighting politics. It's, you're in charge of the law, essentially. And,
shadowing the law. Shadowing the law.
Yeah, I mean... obviously shadowing, but you're in charge of developing ideas and policy in that area.
Yeah.
And, historically, it hasn't been the sexiest of political areas. Now, to be clear, there are now lots of legal issues, like whether we should remain signatories to the European Convention on Human Rights, which is big and controversial politics. There are many people, but on the sort of centre right of politics, that hate the way that he is politicising a British system which basically says everybody has a right to a defence, and that you should not therefore confuse the person you're defending with the person that is defending you. And there is this, we have so much sort of pomp and ceremony in our courts, the wearing of the wigs and the gowns, and the argument for that is it's perfectly clear that, in a sense, your barrister, if you're defending a mass murderer or a terrorist or somebody suspected of terrorism, even if it's a choice that you've made, because you have to understand there is a distinction. There is a so-called cab rank system when you're paid as a barrister. When you do it pro bono, it is your choice to do it. The rules are very clear that you're the cab rank system, that you just have to take the case as a defending barrister doesn't apply. But that is a million miles from, essentially saying, which, to be clear, is the unambiguous implication of that video by Robert Jenrick, and indeed of other things that he said. It's a million miles from, essentially saying you're going to defend somebody from, any kind of, in the British tradition, sense that you endorse this person,
which actually is what,
and the problem is, and it's a real, which is what Jenrick is implying, right? And the problem with Jenrick's attack on the Attorney General, Hermer, which he also uses to attack Starmer, right? And you should, because he was also a human rights barrister, and he has faced attacks of this sort from senior members of the Tory party. And in fact, in that video, Jenrick explicitly says, Starmer shares these views, right? Explicitly says that. The problem is, if that were to gain currency across the British people, right? Essentially, everybody deserves a defence lawyer. Everybody does, right? But who is going to defend, basically people who may or may not have done terrible things in a world where the prevailing view of the British public is if you defend them, you're endorsing them. I mean, this is really harmful stuff.
And we should just weave in here that a spokesperson for the Attorney General's office said exactly this point, that law officers such as the Attorney General will naturally have an extensive legal background and may have previously been involved in a wide number of past cases. Barristers do not associate themselves with their clients' opinions. Yeah. So I think getting back though to the core interest in Robert Jenrick at the moment, he has sort of struck gold here in terms of his social media profile, hasn't he? And I know Kemi Badenoch, when we ask her, always sort of says, "Oh well, it's great to have such a strong top team, etc." But this is now overshadowing her leadership. He is, on social media at least, overshadowing her profile on social media, and at some point that has got to become a problem for her, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, look, let's be absolutely clear. I'm trying to come up with, a metaphorical who's the most boring person in Britain name, because the problem with Kemi Badenoch's leadership at the moment is not just that he may or may not be overshadowing her, but she's just not making the kind of impact that you would expect any party leader to make. I mean, I was talking to a pretty senior member of her team yesterday who was just very blunt and just saying the way that she is conducting herself is not sustainable. And, what this senior Tory meant was she can't simply define the party by what they're against. She's got to start being, she may not, she's right. She can't write a manifesto for the next election so many years out, but she's got to have more than, negative things to say. Everything she says is the government is wrong. But then, as this senior Tory said, is we've got to start saying what we would do instead. And the absence of that, this person says, is a major problem for them.
I found it interesting as well, just to finish on this point, that I saw on Tom Tugendhat's Twitter earlier today. Of course, he ran to be leader himself. Obviously nowhere near as likely as Robert Jenrick to be the next leader, but nevertheless, he seems to have sort of cottoned on to what Robert Jenrick's up to. He said, I am hiring a communications officer, with lots of excitable emojis around it. I'm looking for creative digital minds, videographers, editors, storytellers, people fluent in social platforms with a sharp political instinct, those who can turn complex issues into compelling content. So, I just wonder whether we are getting into an age where politicians increasingly build their personal brands in terms of video format on social media.
Well, they're all looking at, let's be absolutely clear, they're all looking at Nigel Farage.
Well, yeah.
I mean, Nigel Farage, big on TikTok, big on social media, pretty contemptuous of the House of Commons. And actually on sort of both sides, they are recognising that the way that you communicate and garner support ain't what it was in a world of social media.
Well, talking about communication, there'll be a fair bit of that in the run-up to the spending review next week. And we're joined by our economics editor, Joel Hills, from Westminster to discuss the challenges facing the government. Hi, Joel.
Hello there.
Thanks so much for being on the podcast. And the big political talking point, as we're talking right now, is winter fuel allowance, because a few minutes before our recording, the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, made a pretty big hint about what's going to happen with that winter fuel allowance and the thresholds. Not just a hint, really, but pretty much an announcement. She'll be presenting, of course, her spending review next Wednesday, setting out how the budget is divided between government departments over the next 4 years. She's faced the media ahead of it, including our own Carl Dinnan.
You say you've had to say no to some things that your colleagues and you would like to do. Are your manifesto commitments on policing, housing and energy at risk?
We made those commitments in our manifesto and we stick to them. All of the manifesto commitments that we made were fully costed and fully funded.
All right, well, as we say, winter fuel allowance seems to be one of the big themes today. Even if she's looking ahead to departmental budgets, etc., she's going to have to find the money as well for winter fuel allowance. Joel, what did you make of the fact the thresholds, it looks like, will be going back up?
Yeah, well, she's confirmed that there will be an adjustment made before winter, and that some of the 10 million people, we still don't know how many, who have had the payment removed will be getting it reinstated. But there's still ambiguity about the details. I think what she's confirmed in just the timeline, there was a question mark about whether these changes or the U-turn would have been conducted quickly enough for the £300 cash payment to be useful to people as we head into winter. She's confirming that the changes that they intend to make will be made in time for winter, but we still don't know what those changes are. Carl there was asking the right questions, I think, because what's interesting about the spending review next week is, and the reason it's such a really important moment in this Parliament, albeit that spending review sounds crushingly dull and the levels of detail people find remote, alien and fail to connect with, is that it's the moment where the rubber really hits the road. As Carl was pointing out, Labour has made a series of commitments about things it intends to do when in power. It wants economic growth. It's going to deal with net zero. It's going to, we're going to get 1.5 million new homes in the course of this Parliament. But it doesn't have the money to deliver on all the promises that it's made, bluntly. Yeah. And I think in the spending review, we are going to get a year-by-year account of where money will be allocated and to which departments. And there will be winners and there will be losers. And we will find out which priorities actually and which trade-offs the government is finally having to make. So it's a really important moment.
And just to be clear, there will only be two big winners, and they will be health and defence. There will also be another very important distinction, which is there is a ton of additional money for investment in infrastructure because they changed their blessed capital rules so that they can borrow a lot more for investment. The area which is going to be difficult is day-to-day spending, and that means basically money on salaries and people. It's one of the reasons why the police are cutting up rough, because they say they need more people and they're not going to get them, right? And that's why that particular negotiation with Home Office is not yet settled. So, but interesting. The thing for us to do is to get behind what will be some very aggressive spin. We're already seeing it. So today, we've just seen Carl Dinnan, our colleague, putting a question to the Chancellor Rachel Reeves at a press conference where she's announcing £15 billion of investment in transport projects for the Midlands and the North. Big chunk of money. It should be pointed out that quite a lot of those projects won't actually start for a number of years. But nonetheless, it's, if you live in the Midlands and North, this is good news in terms of, trams and train links and all the rest of it. Which
they've heard the promises before.
They have heard them before, but look, I think this is probably real money. It just doesn't. These projects just don't happen that quickly. But you have to make a distinction. And if you're somebody like me or Joel, you do take the view that this kind of investment is important because it does generate growth and it does improve productivity, and we need improved productivity if we're going to get our living standards up. So this stuff matters, but the other side of it, which they will sort of try and hide with announcements like today's, and there will be further big announcements of capital projects, even on the day next Wednesday, is separate from all of that. Budgets that matter to the quality of public services, what's called day-to-day spending, will, for most departments, be squeezed. So it will be a game of two halves or two different stories. And, our job is to make sure people understand both stories, because some of it will be painful and some of it will be good news.
And some of it will be slightly hidden in the back of the Red Book as well, of course.
Can I just come back on the... Robert's raising an interesting point about the transport projects that have been announced today. That's £15 billion worth of spending, and it's been deliberately timed today as a sort of a glimpse of what's to come. But, Robert's absolutely right. We should see this in its proper context. The government today spends £20 billion a year on transport infrastructure. So what we're seeing today is an idea of over the next few years where some of the allocations are going to come. And capital budgets this year and last year were front-loaded and were incredibly generous. Thereafter, in the years ahead, which is the years that the spending review... I'm so sorry, I think that's the editor of News at 10, no doubt wanting to know what's happening with the transport spending today. But thereafter, those budgets become far less generous. And let's bear in mind too that, the defence objectives that have been set out, the government wants us to be a sort of world-beating defence capability. That is going to suck up a lot of that capital investment. It's going to go on submarines and fighter jets and drones. So again, context, I think, is important. The other question mark, of course, which we're not going to get an answer to next week, but which the Chancellor must be really concerned about, is what happens down the road, because all of these commitments are being made. Some of the money will be allocated. It may well be in the years to come there'll be pressure to top up public services, because let's face it, some of them are in a real mess, and some of the targets the governments have set are ambitious. Meanwhile, what's happening in the economy is not good news. If you look at borrowing, it's massively overshooting. If you look at borrowing costs, they've risen despite the fact that interest rates have come down. The economy, there was a flurry of activity at the beginning of the year, but you look at the business surveys and nothing's looking as if the arrow is going to suddenly turn meaningfully in a positive direction for the Chancellor. I think what happens next, really, if the Chancellor's lucky, something will turn up and the economy might suddenly discover a gear it hasn't got. If it doesn't, I think tax rises of some degree are inevitable, bluntly.
No, I mean, look, we've discussed before, Jared and I, that there's a very strong likelihood that in the budget in the autumn she will, miss her fiscal rules again and have to put up taxes, because they will not want to cut spending, particularly since this settlement, the one we're about to announce, on the day-to-day spending side, will be tight. And just to develop a point that Joel was making, it's not comfortable for a chancellor ever for so much of what will determine her resources to be just totally out of her control. So we are speaking at a time when there is, again, enormous uncertainty about the tariffs that important British businesses will pay. Overnight, Donald Trump said to the entire world, I'm now putting another 25% tariff on steel. So there's then ministers then go into sort of panic mode over here. What does that mean for our steel industry? And then they look at the small print of what essentially Trump says. And what he says is that for the time being, the UK, because we have negotiated a trade deal, or rather a tariff deal, let's not overstate what it is, it's a tariff deal with America, the first to do so, this 25% won't initially apply to our steel industry. But that is to skate over the fact that the 25% that he'd already imposed that makes our steel industry totally uncompetitive, right, is still in place. We've got this tariff deal, but he hasn't signed it off, right? And we've got a tariff deal on cars, which he hasn't signed off. And he said he's not going to sign it off till July at the earliest. And actually, there is still a risk, particularly if he doesn't like the way that that we are now responding to the farming element of all of this, that we could find ourselves in July with no tariff deal and 50% tariffs on steel.
There was a really interesting select committee session yesterday with the Business and Trade Select Committee. We had representatives from Jaguar Land Rover, the National Farmers Union, Associated British Foods, and many steel representatives, including Tata, where they were tearing their hair out. I mean, it's an absolute shambles. This trade deal, which was announced to great fanfare on May the 8th.
It's not a trade deal. Let's call it a tariff deal.
It's not a trade deal. It's a tariff agreement, and we don't even have the details of the agreement. There's nothing resembling a legal document that can be signed yet. And British officials, you get the sense, and the evidence that was being given to the Select Committee yesterday, was within days and definitely weeks, they will start, some of those companies will start making redundancies because the orders have been paused. Increasingly, they're actually being cancelled, and that's business that isn't coming back. They can't sustain this. And you have got, I think, to be fair to the British government, an acceptance that officials on this side of the Atlantic are working every hour they can and applying as much pressure that they feel able to apply to the Trump administration, but where there just isn't the same sense of urgency, and where there's tens of other agreements that also are vying for their attention, and there's no sense that this is going to get signed off.
But I think we have to also make a distinction between events that you can control and those you can't. Now, British officials, British ministers cannot control what goes on in Washington. We all know that, and we've also got the most unpredictable president in history. But I want to take us back to the winter fuel sort of announcement, whatever you want to call it, today, because that is another example of this government not controlling stuff that is within its power. So 2 weeks ago, for reasons that I still don't understand, right, Keir Starmer announces in the House of Commons that he is going to be more generous with the winter fuel payment. And he does that at a time when he can't tell us even whether the changes are going to take place in time for this winter. And he cannot tell us, as Joel pointed out, how many additional pensioners will now get the child benefit. Now, at the time, I just thought, this is nuts. It may well be, not child benefit, sorry, winter fuel payment. Winter fuel payment. At the time, I thought, this is nuts, because, if you are going to do a U-turn, do a proper U-turn, right? Tell us what the detail is, right? It looked utterly panicky and just made them look weak. So I then assumed, OK, we will not get another announcement until they've actually worked out how to do it. Now, to be clear, It's complicated to make this change. The simplest thing to do, but it's moderately expensive, what is it, $1.5 billion or something? The simplest thing to do would simply to say it was a one-year measure, now everybody's going to get it again. But they've made it clear they're not going to do that. They're still going to means test it because they take the view, rightly or wrongly, that it's not a good idea to give the winter fuel payment to Elton John and immensely wealthy people. That may or may not be sensible, right? But so they're going to continue to means test it. Actually, means testing a payment like this is really difficult, right?
Well,
the pension credit qualification was simple because they've got a bureaucratic system for paying it on that basis. If you just raise the threshold beyond the pension credit threshold, you're going to have to create a whole new, really expensive delivery mechanism. Now, the simplest way of doing it would be to do, and actually I said this literally on the day that he announced it, and I'm still amazed that they haven't come to the conclusion that this is what they ought to do, and I don't really understand why they haven't. The simplest thing to do would have been to mirror what they do with child benefit, which is everybody gets it if they want it, but you pay it back through the tax system if you're on a higher rate of tax, which they could do with this. They could simply say everybody gets it, but if you happen to be a pensioner on a higher rate of tax, you will pay it back when you make your annual tax return. But for reasons best known to them, they haven't made that decision, and they're continuing. And I think this is the sort of cancer of politics. They are continuing, and indeed of economics, they're continuing with uncertainty, but in this case, uncertainty of their own making, right? Only they can decide this.
Okay. Well, look, the uncertainty continues as we head into the spending review next week. We've got to let Joel go. Joel, thank you so much for joining us on Talking Politics today. Robert, thank you for your analysis too. That's all for now. Robert will be back with me for Talking Politics Q&A, which will drop into your feed on Friday. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or any other podcast platform to make sure you never miss an episode. That includes Robert's fascinating conversation with former Cabinet Secretary Sir Simon Case on the government's defence plans and the threat of China invading Taiwan. It's well worth a listen or watch if you haven't already. Until next time, thanks for joining us.